Welcome to this explainer. Louisiana, 1892. A man boards a train. He buys a first-class ticket, walks down the aisle, and confidently takes a seat in the whites-only railway car. When the conductor approaches to check tickets, the man calmly informs him that under Louisiana law, he is legally black. The conductor immediately stops the train, has the man physically removed, and he is arrested on the spot.
The man's name was Homer Plessy. He was born in New Orleans in 1863. He was a shoemaker, a community activist, and a devoted family man. Under the incredibly complex, highly stratified social hierarchy of the Creole community at the time, his ancestry was overwhelmingly white. He was what the law explicitly and rather absurdly called an octoroon. What that meant was he had exactly one great-grandparent of African descent. His other 7 great-grandparents were European. He looked white, he spoke French, he lived his entire everyday life, for all intents and purposes, as a white man.
And yet, under Louisiana's recently passed Separate Car Act of 1890, Homer Plessy was legally classified as black. That law strictly mandated that black and white passengers had to travel in completely separate railway cars, and violating this rule wasn't just a faux pas, it was a criminal offense. Now, here is the absolutely crucial thing to understand about this event. Plessy did not stumble into his arrest by accident. He walked right into it, completely deliberately. This was part of a brilliant, carefully organized legal challenge arranged by a civil rights organization known as the Citizens Committee. They selected Homer Plessy specifically because his physical appearance proved their entire point. It made the racial classification visible for exactly what it was. It wasn't a biological truth. It was a completely arbitrary, manufactured legal construction.
So Plessy took this all the way up, challenging his arrest by arguing that the Separate Car Act violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. In 1896, the Supreme Court handed down their decision, and they ruled against him, 7-1. That specific ruling established the infamous separate but equal doctrine, and that doctrine went on to ruthlessly govern American racial segregation for the next 58 years. But honestly, the most staggering, mind-bending part of Homer Plessy's story is this. Think about the physical reality of what happened. Absolutely nothing about his physical body changed between the moment he sat down in that seat and the moment the police put him in handcuffs. Not his skin, not his cells, not his DNA. The only thing, literally the only thing, that made him black was the shared legal definition held by the people who had the authority to enforce it. The category didn't exist in nature. It existed entirely in the legal agreement.
The manufacture of race. Let's look at how this agreement was actually built. Because before the 17th century, Europeans absolutely recognized human differences, but they organized those differences along lines of religion, culture, language, and social rank. And the key thing here is that those lines were permeable. They could be crossed. A person from West Africa who converted to Christianity and adopted European customs could actually achieve social mobility. The categories of humanity were fluid. They were not fixed by biology.
The transatlantic slave trade completely shattered that old system. By the mid-17th century, the massive, booming economies of the Caribbean and North America were being built from the ground up entirely on the backs of enslaved African labor. And an economic engine of that scale, it required a massive, permanent justification. The old permeable categories simply weren't going to cut it anymore. Religion was a major problem because technically Christians weren't supposed to enslave other Christians, and enslaved Africans were actively converting to Christianity. Culture was also a problem because culture is easily learned and adopted. What this massive engine of wealth extraction desperately required was a justification that was absolute. It needed to be permanent, it needed to be heritable, and it had to be completely impossible to escape through baptism or education or assimilation. The solution they found was biology. Race, as a rigid category, was manufactured specifically to justify what was being done to African people. Africa isn't just a side note in this story. The exploitation of Africa is the exact reason this belief was produced in the first place.
So between roughly 1650 and 1850, a very specific, highly deliberate intellectual project was undertaken. And it wasn't done by fringe thinkers. It was driven by the most respected European universities and scientific societies. François Bernet published a formal racial classification in 1684. In 1758, the famous botanist Carl Linnaeus included varieties of humans in his definitive classification system. But he didn't just group them. He assigned distinct moral and intellectual traits to physical appearances, baselessly claiming Africans were ruled by caprice and Europeans were ruled by law. By 1795, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach established a rigid five-race taxonomy, and moving into the 1830s, you had figures like Samuel Morton actively measuring the cubic capacity of human skulls to try and scientifically prove an intellectual hierarchy. Let's be very clear about what was happening here. This was not science objectively discovering the concept of race. This was respected European institutions manufacturing race, using the highly authoritative tools of science to give brutal economic exploitation the absolute undeniable authority of nature.
Okay, to really truly grasp how a completely manufactured category can change actual reality, we need to turn to the philosopher Immanuel Kant for just a moment. Back in 1781, Kant completely revolutionized philosophy when he explained that the human mind does not just passively sit there and receive reality like a camera, it actively constructs it. He divided the entire world into two very distinct concepts, the noumenon and the phenomenon. Let me explain those. The noumenon is the thing as it actually exists in itself, completely independent of us. Kant argued that this raw reality is actually unknowable to the human mind. The phenomenon, on the other hand, is the thing as it appears to us, after it's been filtered through our mental categories and biases. Think about it like looking at the world through a pair of permanently tinted, unremovable glasses. You never actually see the raw, unfiltered world, you only ever experience the tinted version. Now, let's apply Kant's framework directly to Homer Plessy. The noumenon of Plessy's physical body contained absolutely zero racial classification. His blood cells didn't know they were black or white. But his phenomenon, his lived social material and legal experience every single day of his life, was entirely organized, dictated, and restricted by that tinted filter of race.
The Thomas theorem applied. So how exactly does a mental filter, a mere idea, harden into a physical iron cage? Let's dive into that.
In 1928, the sociologist W.E.B. Thomas formulated a brilliant concept that became known as the Thomas theorem. It states simply, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Let me give you the classic analogy to explain how this works, the bank run. Imagine a completely healthy, solvent bank. Plenty of cash in the vault, everything is fine. Suddenly, a totally baseless rumor starts spreading around town that the bank is going under. The depositors hear the rumor, they believe it's real, and they panic. So they all rush down to the bank and withdraw all their money at the exact same time. What happens? Those massive, panicked withdrawals actually bankrupt the institution. The initial belief was a complete and total fiction, but because people acted upon it collectively, their belief produced the very real, devastating reality it predicted.
Now, this is the absolutely crucial part. We have to apply this theorem to the history of racial science. European institutions essentially started a civilizational bank run. They defined a completely false situation. They defined humanity as being inherently divided into a strict biological hierarchy, and because authoritative bodies, governments, courts, militaries accepted that false definition as reality and acted upon it, the consequences became terrifyingly real. That entirely false definition directly produced colonial legal codes. It produced chattel slavery. It produced centuries of segregation and massive global wealth extraction. The biological hierarchy they invented was a complete and utter fiction, but the material, bloody reality it created on the ground was absolute.
And this connects us directly to what is arguably the most sophisticated, pervasive propaganda operation in modern human history. You see, the Thomas theorem simply describes what happens naturally and organically when a definition becomes widely shared. Propaganda, however, is the deliberate, calculated engineering of that exact process. The racial science project we've been talking about, that was propaganda in its purest, most potent sense. It was the deliberate production and massive distribution of a false definition of reality, funneled straight through the most authoritative channels available, elite universities, binding legal codes, widely read scientific publications. It was engineered specifically to make the enslavement and colonization of African peoples feel completely natural, inevitable, and scientifically confirmed. It was designed to steer human behavior and justify atrocities at a civilizational scale.
But we're still left with a question. How does a manufactured lie, created by a specific group of people for a specific reason, eventually end up feeling like an invisible law of nature to everybody else? In 1966, sociologists Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman beautifully described a three-step process for this: externalization, objectification, and internalization. To understand this, let's analogize it to kids making up a rule on a school playground. First, you externalize the idea. You and your friends just invent a brand new game with a weird rule, and you tell everyone playing. Second is objectification. Maybe a year passes, new kids arrive at the school and they ask about the game. The older kids just tell them, hey, this is just the rule of the playground. At this stage, the rule actually forgets that it was ever invented. It becomes an object. Third is internalization. 5 years later, brand new kindergartners arrive, and they accept this weird rule as if it's a fundamental law of physics, like gravity. They can't even imagine playing any other way. Now, apply this massive triad to the concept of race. The deep economic need for labor was externalized into scientific classifications and brutal slave codes. Over time, it was objectified into foundational constitutional law, things like the separate but equal doctrine. And finally, it was internalized. Entire generations of people were born into a world where race was simply treated as an absolute, unquestionable reality. They didn't choose to believe the propaganda. It was literally the only version of reality available to them on the playground.
The chain of architecture. Let's trace how this objectified reality gets locked into place, building a relentless chain of architecture across 4 centuries.
Let's look at the links in this chain. In 1662, the colony of Virginia passed a chilling law stating that the legal status of a child follows the status of the mother. With one stroke of a pen, they made slavery both permanent and biological. Jump forward to 1884, at the Berlin Conference. Here, European powers literally sat around a table and partitioned the entire massive continent of Africa. They drew borders across thousands of miles of land, and they did it without a single African nation present. Their justification? The so-called civilizing mission, which was entirely built on the assumption of racial hierarchy. In 1896, as we saw with Homer Plessy, the U.S. Supreme Court locked that exact same hierarchy deep into American constitutional law. And in 1948, the government of South Africa formally instituted apartheid, rigidly classifying every single human being in the country and dictating every minute aspect of their daily lives based purely on those manufactured categories. When you look at this horizontally, it is staggering. It is the exact same foundational belief system forging American segregation, drawing the modern borders of Africa, and engineering South African apartheid.
Shadows on the wall. To truly understand why millions of people living inside these systems simply couldn't see the construction for what it was, we need to look at an ancient allegory.
Around 375 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote the famous allegory of the cave. He asks us to imagine a group of prisoners who have been chained up deep inside a dark cave since the day they were born. They are chained in such a way that they can only face a blank wall. Behind them, out of sight, a fire is burning, and between the fire and the prisoners, people are walking by carrying various objects. The prisoners, of course, can only see the shadows of those objects projected onto the wall in front of them. Because they have never seen the real objects and never seen the fire, they deeply, genuinely believe that the shadows on the wall are the absolute truth of reality. Now, analogize Plato's cave to everything we've talked about in this explainer. The illusion of natural biological race? That is the shadow on the wall. For centuries, ordinary people looked at that shadow, saw the differences in society, and honestly thought it was biology. But the blinding light source casting that massive shadow was the deliberate, legal, economic, and institutional power of the time. It was the humming printing presses, the heavily armed colonial armies, and the gavels of the high courts projecting that image to justify their wealth and their actions.
And this perfectly, brilliantly illustrates the role of the escaped prisoner in Plato's allegory. There are always individuals who manage to break the chains, turn around, and see the fire. Thinkers like the incredible sociologist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois. In his groundbreaking 1903 work, Du Bois famously wrote that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Du Bois saw the shadow for exactly what it was. He was able to name the construction from the inside. He proved through exhaustive sociological research that race was a political and economic mechanism, not a natural one. He essentially stepped out of the cave, turned around, and pointed directly at the fire for everyone to see.
The legacy that persists. So this brings us to the most critical point of all. What actually happens when the science finally stops believing in the shadow? Fast forward to the year 2000 and the completion of the first draft of the Human Genome Project. After finally mapping the entirety of human DNA, the global genetic consensus was absolutely undeniable. Scientists found that genetic variation within so-called racial groups actually vastly exceeds the variation between them. The final scientific conclusion was absolute and unequivocal. There is no gene, there is no chromosome, there is no biological marker whatsoever that corresponds to the social category of race. The light source of racial science, a fire that had been deliberately stoked and burned brightly for over 300 years, was finally completely extinguished.
But here is the truly devastating reality of our modern world. The construct is completely gone from the science, but the consequences persist stubbornly in reality. The scientific belief went extinct, but the massive racial wealth gap did not suddenly stop. The arbitrary, highly destructive colonial borders drawn in Berlin did not stop. Institutional inequality and the heavily inherited disadvantages of centuries of weaponized legal architecture remain entirely painfully real today. The Thomas theorem is still quietly humming in the background, operating perfectly. The original false definition has been entirely dismantled by genetics, but the physical reality that it produced continues to function exactly as it was designed to.
Which brings us right back to where we started, Homer Plessy. His story, from a Louisiana train car in 1892, isn't just some dusty historical anecdote. It is the perfect, unbroken mirror of our current reality. Homer Plessy was arrested, and his life was derailed by an absurdity. He was detained by a legal definition that had absolutely no basis in nature. Today, we still live our lives inside the social, economic, and geographic architecture built by that exact same entirely dismantled definition. The category of race was a deliberate, manufactured fiction from the very beginning, but the cage it built around the world was, and still is, made of iron.
After seeing how the concept of race was manufactured, institutionalized, and enforced across centuries, do you think it is a biological reality, or simply the most expensive fiction the modern world has ever agreed to believe?